Hi there and welcome to our webinar Wednesday. This is the presentation of Overview Benchmarking within Emergency Services, delivered on the 5th of May 2021. So, benchmarking within emergency services. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to deal with an introduction to benchmarking, why we benchmark and why is it useful. We're going to talk a little bit about the types of data we might use, with examples of open data as well as data taken from our project work. We're going to use examples throughout, and we'll finish with a case study on the National Forensics Process work done some time ago. So that's the plan for the webinar. I'm going to start with, what is benchmarking? Benchmarking is a phrase we hear a lot in our day-to-day life. Apple sets the new benchmark. Compared to industry standards, how did we sit? Claims of best in class, particularly if you're my broadband provider. But really what we're talking about when we talk about benchmarking is measuring and comparing. We do this to generate an understanding of our position relative to our peers. We might compare the response performance of different fire stations or the clearance rates of different CID teams. What we're doing when we do this is striving to explain the differences in outputs, highlighting areas which require improvement or further exploration. Benchmarking can give us a rule of thumb. Others might describe this as a range of anticipated values. I'd expect that the whole-time fire station would mobilise its first appliance in between 60 to 90 seconds. Not all will. Some might be more rapid, 45 seconds. Others may take much longer. But properly executed benchmarking wouldn't necessarily say that a fire crew taking 2 minutes to mobilise was bad, but would strive to understand why this figure is so much higher than its peers. There could be several factors involved that may explain this, some of which might be possible to mitigate. For example, it could be caused by the large building footprint or a lack of space for firefighters to get into their equipment. The point in benchmarking isn't necessarily to say good or bad, but it allows the comparisons and gives the ability to prioritise efforts on tackling the outliers. We see similar cases when considering police deploying policy. Here, we're looking at how many units, known as response vehicles, are being sent to an immediate incident. Typically, I'd expect this figure to range between 1.5 and 2.5 units, but every force it will be subtly different. For example, if the policy was to double crew all vehicles, then we might send fewer vehicles. This might be the case in the Met, for example. If a force found themselves in the enviable position that they were awash with resource, we might see more units deployed. It very much depends on circumstances. But it's useful to understand just how you, as an organisation, stack up. One of the greatest challenges when it comes to benchmarking is choosing metrics. Choosing metrics that are fair and give useful comparisons. The graph shown below on the slide could be any generic volume-based metric. In many respects, the metric doesn't matter. The Met at the top there is such a large force that it dwarfs all the other forces, making comparisons incredibly tricky. With a volume-based metric, size dictates the outcome. The Met will almost always be bigger than TVP, always bigger than Hearts, which will always be bigger than Dyfed Powys. Now, one option would be just to exclude these outliers, saying goodbye to the Met and City of London. And in some cases this would be appropriate, but we'd still be left with scale imbalances. Another way to make this process more meaningful is to normalise based on either population or size-based metrics. This will change the slant of the analysis, now placing greater focus on organisations that over or under index on a particular measure. To have fair comparisons, measures need to be meaningful. Many of you will be familiar with the concepts of most similar groups or forces, depending on whether we're talking fire or policing. These organisations are deemed to be most like you, having similar size, geography and potentially even similar demographics, such as deprivation. For our first example, we're going to look at breath tests. Over the past 3 years, I've conducted several projects with various roads policing teams. What became abundantly clear throughout is that the use of roadside breath tests varies considerably across forces. Some forces, these tests are routine and part of the job, while for others it seems an undertaking only really done during specific road safety campaign periods. So let's have a look at the data and see if my experiences are reflected within the data. Just a note on that data, we're using open source data from data.police.uk. Dead easy to download, and there's a whole host of open data at force level available to you. So looking at the breath test data, the scatter plot graph shows a number of tests conducted by force in 2019 and the associated positive test rate. Although there are definite outliers, there does seem to be a pattern that forces conducting the most tests per head of population see lower positivity rates. These ones in the bottom right hand corner. Does this mean that those in the top left are only testing suspects when we know they're over the limit? Or are these in the bottom right applying a much more speculative scattergun approach? We don't know, but it's worth understanding how different forces sit on the spectrum. As the slide demonstrates, Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire are at the two extremes of the positivity spectrum. Cambridgeshire seeing over 30% positive rate, whereas Bedfordshire seeing less than 5%. The odd thing about this is that both of these forces share a border, and they're part of the BCH Roads Policing collaboration. So I for one would like to understand some of the differences between them a bit more. But before we do that, let's have a look at North Wales. Now I understand North Wales is sparsely populated, but it does seem to be testing at a rate almost double that of the next force. I don't necessarily understand why, but it does feel like they're possibly doing too many tests. Even within this really simple chart, themes have emerged. It starts the cogs turning, posing questions about the approach taken, and highlights areas needing further investigation. But benchmark doesn't necessarily have to be against another organisation. It is possible to benchmark against yourselves. As we see here, when we've changed the graph somewhat, so it's the same X and Y axis, but instead of different police forces, we're looking at Bedfordshire across a different time period. 2006 to 2008, there seemed to be a different policy in place. Fewer tests, but a much higher positivity rate. Recently, from 2015 onwards, we've seen a reduction in the number of tests. But then also in 2019, we've seen this massive decline in the proportion of tests that are coming back positive. And that's definitely worth understanding further. So that's the picture for Bedfordshire. But if we look at Cambridgeshire, we see a very different picture. Cambridgeshire has fewer tests. It's in reducing number of tests. But the rate of positive test percentage, the rate has remained relatively consistent across the last 5 or 6 years. And just to complete the picture, we've done Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and now on to Hertfordshire, BCH. We see a similar trend to Cambridgeshire in the sense of reducing number of tests, but the positive rate has remained fairly consistent over the past 8 years, generally between 15 and 20%. Finally, if we overlay these three pictures on top of each other, we see the journey that each of these forces have taken throughout the last 12 years. But which is right? Are Cambridgeshire testing enough? Is Bedfordshire failing in their process with less than 10% positive? At this point, I don't have the answers, but going through this benchmarking process has generated many focused, pertinent questions. So we're going to leave breath testing for a second, and we're going to move on to another data set, stop and search. Now, stop and search is a highly contentious area. Many feel that's even discriminatory. Today, I'm not going to address the merits of stop and search. Instead, I'm going to focus on the ways in which the legislation has been applied by different forces. Welcome to my rainbow band graph. It's an odd name, but let me take you through it and explain. On the y-axis, we have the number of stops made, and on the x-axis, we have the number of arrests. The colour bands indicate the arrest proportion, or percentage. Now, I'd expect most of the forces within the orange and yellow bands, indicating between a 10 and 20% arrest rate. But it's evident here that that's not always the case. We have 4 forces in this light blue, showing an arrest rate of between 5 and 10%. Wiltshire, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire and Gwent. So that's interesting to understand why they might be slightly different. We also see a main outlier here as the City of London, where the arrest rate is almost 1 in 3, so between 30 and 35%. It's quite evident to see here that across these forces there have been quite different ways of applying stop and search policies. Now, moving on from the open data, which relies on Home Office returns, we're going to move on to a couple of examples of benchmarking using data gleaned from projects. This has all been anonymised, but it does help to illustrate the point. Firstly, incident mix in policing. Each force is responsible for the way it grades incidents that come into the Force Control Room, or FCR. Emergency or immediate incidents are graded using the Thrive framework. An incident in Stockton should be graded the same way as it would in Southampton or Swansea, right? Well, that's not quite our experience when it comes to working with incident data. Shown in the graph here, if I were heading up the response section for Force 4, I'd want to understand why we not only had one of the highest proportion of immediates, but coupled with this, more than 40% of our incidents have been graded priority. Put together, this means that over 60% of the incidents coming into our Force Control Room require a response within 1 hour. For other forces, this figure is closer to 40%. Alternatively, if I were in Force 1, why am I seeing more than 20% of our incidents being graded as immediate? Are we sure that the policy is correct and it's been applied properly? There may be a case that we're overgrading, where people in the Force Control Room are being risk averse, and meaning that we send more to immediates and priorities than we might need. At this point, there's no right or wrong, but once again, this is a prompt for further thinking. Many of you will have seen this type of benchmarking done with neighbourhood policing. In this example, we show 8 forces in which we've done activity analysis. We compare how neighbourhood PCs are spending their time. If I were the force shown in yellow, I'd be concerned with the high amounts of time spent on patrol and other policing activity, compared with the lower levels of problem solving relative to the peers. When doing any of these comparisons, it's always worth coming back to the question, does it feel right? How are others looking at this? And are they addressing the problems differently? We're now going to move on to a case study example that Peter's going to deliver, benchmarking national forensic processes.